Great. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege to introduce the next panel on a very important and top-of-mind topic for, I'm sure, all of us here in this room around new frontiers in diversity and inclusion. There's been a lot of talk over the past few years about themes like Me Too and diversity in the workplace. But I think the question for today is, it's a good time to check in and see how are we doing and how are we actually progressing and driving real change. And then secondarily, how can technology help with that? My name is Tom Griffiths. I'm the CEO of a company called Hone. We have a new training platform that helps modern distributed companies train their managers and leaders. So we think of it as a very important responsibility of ours to weave diversity and inclusion training throughout the manager and leadership development that we do. But this topic is a particular interest for me because, as we build a company, I've taken a number of lessons from previous experiences. My last company was a company called FanDuel that I helped to build from 5 founders to over 500 people. And we did some things well when it came to diversity and inclusion, but also had a number of challenges, as you can imagine, with a technology plus a sports company. And so as we build Hone from the ground up, we're trying to be really intentional about how we do that. We have a majority female board. We've sought out investors that share our values. And I think just one lesson for me over time has been you have to lead these kind of things from the top. We do a number of other things, but I'm excited for the panel today to learn about things we can do even better. We've got a fantastic group to talk us through the topic, chaired by Emma Hinchliffe, who's a writer at the moment for Fortune and focuses on women's issues over the past few years, as well as a group who've got varied experiences leading HR and diversity and inclusion in fast-growing and large-scale companies. Join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you for that introduction, and hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're here to talk about the new frontiers of inclusion, and I will let our panelists introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Marisa Grimes. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Mastercard.
Hi, I'm Tammy. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Carrot. We make it easy for companies to deliver fertility benefits.
Hello, I'm Lopez, Senior Director of HR for the NBA. Hi everyone, Jazmine Boatman. I head up DDI's New York operation. DDI is a global leadership consultancy where we hire, promote, and develop leaders.
Great, thank you everyone. So why don't we start with the basics? What does inclusion mean to you and at your organizations? Whoever would like to start.
Jump in. Sure. So at Mastercard, one of the things that we've been focused on over the last several months is really just educating the organization on what we mean when we talk about inclusion. And it may sound very, very basic, but it's important because we know that different companies define inclusion differently and think about inclusion differently. And even at Mastercard, over the last couple of years, we've sort of shifted the way that we think and talk about inclusion. So for us at Mastercard, we look at inclusion as really a mindset and a leadership skill set that has to be developed across the organization. So when we think about what an inclusive leader looks like, we think about it in terms of someone who can build and maintain diverse teams. So, that's something that all of our leaders need to be able to do. And when we think about it, that's really, leaders are expected to learn different leadership skills like developing their business acumen, building executive presence. We want inclusion to be another leadership skill set that they have to develop that becomes a natural part of how we develop our leaders and how we think about leading inclusively across the organization.
Yeah, hi, my name's Tammy. So at Carrot, we think about inclusion from the perspective of equal access for everybody for fertility care. And when we think about and define fertility care, we mean everything from basic learning and education to fertility testing for males and females, egg freezing, IVF, adoption, and the entire suite of third-party reproduction, including donor gametes as well as gestational carrier services. And in the old sort of classic insurance world, only certain types of people can unlock infertility benefits through the carriers. You must be a male and a female. You must have a medical diagnosis of infertility, which means 6 to 12 months of being unable to get pregnant under the supervision of a doctor. And so for us, we really think about, well, what does the modern workplace need? What does the future of work mean when we think about families and how we define families? And in our world, we have built a platform and a product that allows every employee, no matter age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, and we enable them to be able to access fertility benefits equally, regardless of why they seek care. And when we work with customers and our clients, we really are working with them with their benefits team as well as any D&I initiatives to really think about what are the holistic business goals that they need to try to achieve, and we're really proud to be able to support them in achieving that.
That's great. On our end, I think inclusion, I'll use a little bit of a sports analogy. We very much, of course, we very much view it as everyone has an opportunity to be a valuable player of a team. But we also want to make sure that once you're on that team, you have equal access and opportunity to advance in the game, which are two very different things. I think often you hear, inclusion, we want to make sure that we are being inclusive in our hiring, we're being inclusive in our promotion cycles, and that's wonderful. But once that happens, once you have folks through the door, what's the experience post that, right? So are they having that same experience? Is it consistent? Do they have the same support? Do they have the same coaching? Do they have the same opportunity to have managers who are propelling them forward? So those are where we really try to focus much of our energy, specifically on the HR end of my role.
For me, my passion is leadership. DDI's passion is leadership. So if I think about what leading inclusively means, in its essence, if I use fewer words as possible, it's bringing a leader who leads inclusively brings out the best in people. Someone who creates conditions for a variety of perspectives to be appreciated and heard. And I think a leader's job in doing that is also from a systems perspective to eliminate some of that bias, but it's also in how they communicate, how they make decisions, the culture that they create in the team that allows a variety of perspectives to be appreciated.
Yeah, Marisa and Jazmine, you both mentioned inclusive leadership. How do you build or teach that skill set?
I definitely think it is a teachable skill set. I also think there are things we could be doing from a systems perspective to select people who are more likely to be good communicators, to lead inclusively. But if you think about the core skills of inclusivity, they're not really that different from a lot of core leadership skills. Good communication skills, good interpersonal skills. And those are definitely things that can be taught in the classroom. They can be taught with books. They could be taught in coaching models. And so I think the blocking and tackling of interpersonal skills and good communication skills in combination with an awareness of the biases that are combined with the diversity inclusive initiatives can definitely be developed.
Mm-hmm. So we look at it as we want to embed inclusion in our leadership development programs. So we have a number of existing leadership development programs where we've embedded an inclusion focus into it. Because again, we feel like this is a muscle that needs to be exercised, it needs to be developed, and it needs to be maintained. And by embedding it into programs that already exist, it's, we're not having people come and say, okay, now I have to put on my inclusion hat and I have to think like an inclusive leader. No, this is part of how leadership works and how leadership should be. So we implement it through training for our existing leaders and employees across the organization at all levels. But also from a hiring perspective, when we're looking at potential talent, I absolutely agree those interpersonal skills are really critical. And we look for things like people who are intellectually curious, people who demonstrate that they have an open mindset, people who demonstrate that they have some self-awareness and emotional intelligence. And we at Mastercard, we talk about IQ, EQ, and DQ. And IQ is your intellect, right? And that's obviously critically important to your success, but it will only get you so far in life. EQ is emotion, right? And so that's also critical to your success, but we take it a step further and talk about the DQ, which is decency quotient. And when our CEO, Ajay, goes out and he talks about our company and he talks about culture, he says that we aim to be a winning culture with decency at its core. And I think that's a really powerful statement and a way to look at it. those are the types of leaders that we want to bring into the organization that demonstrate that decency quotient, because that goes a long way to building inclusion in the organization.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit more about hiring. What else do the rest of you look for to bring people into the organization who will support inclusion when they're there?
So in my former life, I was a talent acquisition professional, and one of the things that and people will definitely disagree with me, I am not a stickler on your education. I am a big believer in life experience, exposure, in people being able to understand how to navigate an organization and how to have a particular management style. Those are the things that really always kind of jumped out at me. Definitely, my interview style with these types of candidates, specifically at a more leadership level, would be really focused on how they would handle complex employee situations. Because, as many of you know, HR professionals, we are the ones who end up dealing with the challenges that come from those. So I wanted to make sure that up front we were bringing in the right people. But really, I guess my challenge, in the inclusion space has always been this kind of back and forth in terms of you want to try new places to source talent from, you want to kind of get out of the box, but then ultimately you're left with the challenge of having a business who may feel that that degree is necessary or that particular certification is necessary. So it's finding that balance and being able to make the case for why that is not necessary to have a solid talent come through your door.
Yeah, I think a holistic approach to thinking about who would be successful at this job is part of an inclusion initiative. We tend to fall prey to these biases like homophily, which is essentially a mini-me syndrome, where you look for people who went to school where you went to school, who look like you, or you think about who was successful in this role last. That's what the new person who's coming into that role should look like. When we think about, from a business perspective, what we're competing against, we're going to need more variety of perspectives in order to understand our customers, who ideally are also getting more and more diverse. So really thinking about what is a profile of people who would be successful in this job. And some of that, to your point, Lauren, is experience, but that's only part of the picture. It's what can they do? We do a lot of development in most of our organizations. Some of those skills can be developed. But to me, there's also the will do, that motivational component that we really have to spend more time thinking through and culling and looking in a variety of places in the dark corners to really identify the people who maybe we don't think of as natural people who would step into these roles, but could be your hidden talent, your hidden rock star. You just didn't know because they were doing a different kind of job, doing the same kinds of skills.
Yeah, we're really proud that we have an incredibly diverse team at Carrot across all different vectors, and that's been important in thinking about how to build the team because of the customers that we serve and the employees that we serve. And so, when we think about what is the best way that Carrot can support employees in their fertility journeys and their fertility experiences, certainly we are experts in this category, but we have partnered with other partners in this space to bring in and come and do training. So Family Equality Council is one of the organizations that comes into Carrot on a regular basis and does, for example, training around transgender healthcare and fertility care for our care navigation team. We certainly have, we support companies globally across 40 countries, including the US, and so there are global trainings and learning about what the nuances are from culture to culture and country to country in terms of thinking about access to care. And what are the barriers is just sort of structurally within those countries and within those infrastructures around access. Sometimes egg freezing is not actually illegal in a country, but is culturally inaccessible. And so really understanding that, baking that into our team and our staff so that we can provide the best possible service to our members and to our customers. And separately, I think in general, we've made it a big sort of priority this year to begin to look at this stage, sort of manager support and training, and really giving people the basic tools and skills to be able to manage fast-growing teams, to be able to master sort of communication skills and other leadership skills that will be important for continuing to build on a team that we have that is quite diverse.
Yeah, Marisa and Tammy, you're working on these issues at very different companies, at a large global organization and at a small startup. So
Not that small.
Not that small. But as the only founder on the stage right now, what are the challenges of working on inclusion at a smaller company versus at a large global company?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I think when we think of I never really thought of sort of like what are the challenges of building a diverse team as I was building the team. More than half of our cap table is women. I have a female co-founder as well as a male co-founder. My female co-founder is a doctor, my male co-founder is an engineer. And as I said, sort of our team has, because of just the way that we operate, the business that we're in, the way that we see the world, and the leadership styles that we have brought to the table, we have seen our company grow in a very diverse and inclusive way across every single vector: age, sexual orientation, sex. We have half the company who are female. So I think it's really both bottom up and top down, and thinking about, okay, everything as important as leadership training and coaching and sort of bringing in other people and third-party vendors to support these ongoing initiatives, but also, being very, I guess, thoughtful about what is the interview process. How do we want to look at resumes? Do we want to be blind about it? Should certain people be blind about it? Like really refining all of the time. And because we are a smaller company, and part of our advantage is the ability to be very iterative and move very quickly, identify problems, and fix them very quickly. I think that we really lean into that, not just in the product and in our sales and in our growth, but also in how we want to actively iterate our culture and make it better every day.
Mm-hmm. So for us at Mastercard, it's funny because we actually still sort of think of ourselves as a relatively small company. When I joined Mastercard 7 years ago, we had about 6,000 employees, so a lot smaller than most people think we are. Now we're at about 15,000. So we've grown really quickly in a short amount of time, and much of that growth has come through acquisitions. So when you acquire a company, you're not just getting their products and their technology, you're getting their people and their culture as well. And so that presents a lot of opportunity for us from a diversity perspective, but there's also some challenges because you want to ensure that you are extending the programs to all 15,000 employees who are, scattered around the globe in the most effective way. So we've been working on ways to scale our programs and also make sure that there's some consistency across our programs. But also one of the things that we started to do last year and we've really been focused on this year is developing regional inclusion action plans. So we know that different countries, different regions have different viewpoints and look at diversity differently in different places of the world. There are some cultural nuances that we have to consider, and there are also different business priorities based on different regions. So we've been working with each of our regions and each of our business units to understand what are their priorities, what are their needs from a workforce standpoint, from a diversity standpoint, where are we doing well, where are there some gaps that we need to address, and developing strategies to address those. And that's one thing that I think while we have that consistent layer across the company around our global inclusion strategy, having those regional action plans and those business unit action plans will really help us get to the root of seeing a lot of progress around the work that we're doing.
Yeah, some of you have mentioned programming at your companies and elsewhere. How much can programming accomplish? What can and can't it do?
So I definitely think diversity inclusion programming is extremely helpful, but I am much a believer that it is more supportive than it is leading the charge. Meaning, before you get to the point of having your ERGs or your resource groups and you're having conferences and so on, I think you have to stop and take a hard look at who you are as an organization, right? Do we even have the foundation to support hopefully what the outcome of this programming would be? Are we setting folks up to come to us in this way and then be disappointed that we actually are not in line with what we're putting out there and projecting within our programming? So that is often the step that is missed because it's often the hardest thing to tackle because it is taking a very serious look inward and saying, what are we actually not doing well? Or what haven't we even kind of scratched the surface on? So my thoughts on programming are essentially they're a wonderful thing to do. I think specifically homegrown and what I would call kind of more organic programming, meaning employee-led, not an HR initiative, not a business initiative. It's truly your employees coming together for the needs that they want and projecting that forward. But I would say before you get there, you really want to understand the why. What are we trying to solve? And can we actually get there first before you kind of go down that next path?
I think inclusion is a bit of a cultural, well, it's not a bit, it's a cultural movement. It's a cultural value too. Do you operate as an organization with a growth mindset? If any of you were in the learning culture session earlier today, she was talking about growth mindset, and instead of talking about employee research or resource groups, it's also about ambassadors. How can you use, so I loved your terminology about organic led. How can you use groups like that as ambassadors of the message, ambassadors of the values? Because we've all been a part of organizations where values were driven top down, and they don't actually feel like values. They're just a list of things on a website. But if you're really trying to create an inclusive culture, that's a culture that everyone needs to be adopting. And you need pockets you need both the system side, some programming, but you also just need people out there living it, making decisions, and being rewarded for doing that as well. 2 cents on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of the conversation on diversity and inclusion is what you hear from your employees at your companies and organizations. So how do you navigate, especially for the HR professionals on the stage, how do you navigate employee feedback and incorporate into what you're thinking about these issues?
Sure. For employee feedback, it's really interesting, specifically when you're on the HR side, because you often want to make sure that there is a trust component with the employee coming to you and sharing feedback on whatever the topic may be. But there's also a bit of a call to action, specifically if it's something egregious, right? You, of course, want to raise it to the right authorities and parties. What I would say is what I don't think we do enough is taking that feedback and going to an immediate coaching or action plan with that manager, if it's, let's say, a manager complaint. Often with inclusion, what you'll find is managers want to do the right thing, they're just not equipped, whether it be the language, whether it be the comfort level to have sometimes difficult or awkward conversations. I've had many managers who say, I want to do the right thing, I just don't want to use the wrong pronoun, or I just don't want to offend anyone. So the intent is there, and I think that's where you want to meet them. You want to meet them at their point of intent and then coach from there. So this is where I say, in terms of you can put people through as much training as you want, unconscious bias and so on. I think that's great, again, as a support model. But if you really truly want to change the behaviors, one-on-one coaching is ultimately where you'll have probably the largest impact, because you will have that comfort level for that manager or leader, whoever it may be, to say, this is where I'm really uncomfortable, this is where I don't feel I have that language, or just I'm not equipped, can you help me from here? And then get them to where you need to be ultimately.
I think feedback's such an interesting thing, because if you think about a really inclusive culture, sometimes feedback is top-down only, and a real inclusive culture has feedback always. And to your point, Lauren, I keep plussing your points. I just love them. The idea of equipping leaders to have those conversations is really important. When you talk about inclusion and diversity, those are some sticky feedback and coaching situations. So we can't tell people, you really offended someone when you did that. You have to tell them, here's what you should do next time if you find yourself in this situation. Because some people are ill-equipped, and some people have a lack of exposure, and some people just don't have the skills to handle those situations. So when you build a culture of trust, it's assuming good intent and giving people the tools to have clear feedback conversations, encourage feedback up, sideways, and down, so that they're hearing multiple perspectives. I think the feedback connection into inclusions are really interesting.
Yeah, I think the idea of an organic culture, and it really needs to come from the teams themselves, is important. At Carrot, one of the things that I've been really impressed with, that has been primarily employee-led, is this idea of a weekly retrospective that the team does at the whole company, or anybody in the company who wants to participates. And some people are regulars, and some people pop in and out, and some people choose not to participate. But the whole point is that as an employee group, as a team, you sort of look back on the week, actively surface the things that went well, surface the things that did not go so well, and then suggest some solutions for how we can make it better next week. And those things can be really, really small, around I heard someone say this and I would prefer it to have been said like this. And again, it's meeting each other as colleagues at the point of intention, and supporting each other and sort of growing. And then, of course, if there is something, that requires an escalation where there is a manager needs to be involved, that those paths are always very clear because the outcomes of those weekly retrospectives are actually posted in public. So I think, that there is a lot, but only so much that leaders and managers can do at a company to set the tone. And when you can really get some of this work to be done at a peer-to-peer level, it can be very powerful.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about technology. What interesting technologies are you seeing being used for diversity and inclusion right now?
We're exploring virtual reality, which I know sounds a little back to the future when you think about it. But the struggle we've had with talking about inclusion is that everybody's coming in with all these different life experiences. So how do you equalize that in a business context? Because that's what we're talking about, diversity inclusion in a business context. So what we've been exploring and partnering with other technology partners, because this isn't necessarily our skill set, but we're playing around with it, which is to put on a VR headset. If any of you have put these on, it's really disorienting. And to put yourself in the experience of someone who's excluded from a meeting, where you're not being heard, where people just keep talking over you, and there's verbal and there's nonverbal cues, but you're actually at the table as the person, and you experience that. And to me, the power is in the debrief. After everyone has a similar experience, let's talk about how that made you feel. The feedback we've been getting so far is it's really powerful for people to be able to be part of this experience that creates empathy and reflection. Because when you just talk about it, you sit in a table and you talk about when have you been excluded or what is diversity or inclusion feel like, it can seem too high level, too abstract, not tangible enough. So when you put yourself in the situation that most of us have been in, although some of the people we've tested this with have been like, this has never happened to me. And I think, how lucky for you that no one has ever, you've never felt like they didn't take your idea and listen to you in a meeting. But that's been a really powerful way for us to actually bring people deeper into the experience and not just talk about it, so that they can actually think about what are the times they've experienced this, what are the times they've seen it happen to other people, and how could they start to take action on that?
I don't have one specific answer, but I will say I think the strides happening in the AI space, specifically as it comes to recruitment, the new ATS systems that are out there, HCM systems that are doing things, for some as radical as removing people's last names or just names in general, and just sticking to the exact skill sets and experiences that you need to know for the role, for the interview. I think those are things that are, you would think that they would have been here 20 years ago because it's a pretty simple fix. But we are getting to a point where we are more comfortable in that space now. And I'm really supportive of that, not only as someone, who has recruited talent for many years, but someone who is also a Latina female and has had similar struggles in terms of kind of getting to be known in the workplace and applying to roles and not hearing back or being ghosted, as we say now, by recruiters. So it's important to be able to just stick to what you need to know. I think we have asked way too much of candidates, testing and essays and bending over backwards and all kinds of different things, when you really just need to know what skills are you bringing in. Can you actually do this job? And how are you going to behave in this culture, right? What does that look like for us? So I think those are some really interesting strides, and I would love to see that continue.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I want to take your question.
Well, I think, it sounds like those technologies and new ways of approaching hiring are sort of getting involved in the conversation about how you approach objectivity versus subjectivity in hiring. What else are you all doing to create that balance?
So we build software as a service, and for the enterprise, and the idea of our software is that it is inclusive. Nobody feels excluded. The reason I started this company years ago was was because I was excluded from the insurance system. I went to a clinic, put down my insurance card. It was denied. I was doing egg freezing. I did not have infertility. Put down my credit card. $40,000 later, I have 12 eggs in a freezer. And I think the building technology and experiences and modules and support teams that can really adapt to any kind of care, whether it's same-sex, single intended parent, heterosexual couple, whatever it is, our software is really adept to serve everybody. On the AI front, I've seen a lot of really interesting new technologies around reporting and sort of giving employers as well as employees the ability to surface a moment of possible discrimination or something that made somebody uncomfortable without necessarily escalating it entirely, but also just creating a record of it and it can be anonymized or not. There's an app called Spot that does this very well. And I do think that within HR tech that the AI pieces are going to become really important.
So I completely agree. Our HR team is also exploring a lot of new technologies like AI to make sure that bias doesn't creep into our vetting and application process. But we're also doing a lot of things that focus on how we're developing and promoting talent within the organization. So we started to embed inclusion into our talent review and planning process that happens every year. And this is where the conversations happen around succession planning and identifying high potential talent who may be ready to take on a bigger role within the organization. So we wanted to make sure that everyone was being evaluated fairly and equally, but we also wanted to understand what were some of the trends around various groups that show where there may be some developmental gaps that we need to think about addressing. So now we provide data to all of the leaders as they're going into their talent review and planning discussions so that they can get an accurate picture of what their teams look like from a diversity standpoint and identify any gaps that need to be addressed. And this has been hugely important because if you think about it, you're thinking about your team and say you have a team of 10 people. It may be a very balanced team. You may have equal gender representation. It may be a very diverse team. But if you see that all of the women on the team are not high performers and all of the men are, you may want to ask yourself why that is and what needs to be done to correct that, because you'll find yourself in a situation where you don't have a pipeline of women to be able to move into more senior roles in the future. So we want to make sure that we're looking at those things during that process and addressing them as we need to.
Yeah. A related but sometimes talked about as a separate topic is pay equity. From your perspective, how does pay equity relate to inclusion and diversity?
Well, I think about this a lot. And from the perspective of what we do, we really think about access to fertility benefits, and specifically what we mean is access to financial coverage for fertility care. There have to be dollars connected to it. Access to fertility benefits is deeply connected to wage equality. If you think about who has access and who doesn't, the people who do not have access are paying for an aspect of their health care out of pocket, sometimes from their savings, sometimes mortgaging their homes, sometimes taking on massive amounts of medical debt in order to pay for egg freezing, IVF, surrogacy, adoption, or whatever. And for me, as I mentioned before, I spent $40,000 of my own dollars on egg freezing. It's $40,000 present day dollars. But what are those dollars, 10, 20, 30, 40 years into a future inside an investment vehicle or some sort of retirement? And so, we really think about the access questions regarding fertility benefits and equal access as being deeply connected to wage equality. Because if you don't have that access at work as a fundamental part of your healthcare coverage, that means that you are paying for it somewhere else. And that's typically, especially in the fertility sector, falls primarily on consumers and employees directly.
The one thing I'd say, it's related to pay, not necessarily your actual take home, but one of the things that I would love to see employers do more is really focus on the whole life cycle of their employee. And to your point about kind of the benefits and perks, student loan forgiveness or assistance with student loans, more childcare opportunities or options, discounts and so on, or some type of stipend. Because when you really think about where everyone is within their employee life cycle, we all have competing priorities, to say the least. And when you think about how sometimes those are perceived when you may not be coming into a situation with the same level of income, or you may not be at that point in life where, saving in the IRA is important right now, or, stock incentives are important right now. But you know what, paying that student loan so you have the ability to potentially travel for your role and become more worldly and become more exposed and become what you would consider a more valuable asset to that team. Those are the things that folks want these days. Being able to have your child in a quality childcare facility and not have to break the bank to do so you can show up with a clear mind day to day to do your job. Those are the things that I think are extremely important, and employers still playing a little bit of catch up in, and they do lead to the inequality that we see within the workplace.
For me, equity is it's an outcome of inclusivity. So you could, in an ideal world, you could level women, gender equity, the gender pay gap, but tomorrow someone's going to promote someone, and that person could be a man, it could be a woman, and then the gap is off kilter again. So to me, equity is the thing you're going for, but you get there through inclusive leadership, through inclusive policies, through inclusive systems, and an entire organization who makes decisions against that same value system. Otherwise, you're just still chasing this thing around the thinking of the thing we played in school with the ball. What is that? Tetherball. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. You just keep going around that thing. I obviously think it's a critical issue. I think solving it in isolation is a futile task.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience if anyone has anything for our panelists. Sure, I think a microphone should be headed your way.
Thank you so much for your contributions. They were rich and super insightful. So I feel like when it comes to D&I in the workplace, I hear companies or maybe even CEOs say, it's something we're working on, don't worry, it's something we're working on. And when it comes to the product team, the sales team, the marketing team, there are clearly defined goals and there are accountability systems in place if they don't meet those goals. But with D&I, we're working on it. And I don't need to list all the studies that show, D&I actually produces better business performance. I'm curious to hear from you. How do you create a condition inside of a company or systems to make sure that this isn't something where you're working on and it's an actual plan that's just as robust as the product team's quarterly action plan or the sales team's quarterly action plan?
That's a great question.
Once again.
Well, I think for us, I think that's where our regional action plans that I talked about and our business unit action plans have been so critical, because we really do sit down with the individual leaders of the regions, the regional presidents, the heads of each of the business units, and we really lay it out plainly what their organization looks like and where we see the gaps that need to be solved for. And then we hold them accountable. So we put in a plan in place. We review it with them quarterly so they can see how the needle is moving, and see where we need to continue to invest in making sure that we're seeing the progress that we want to see.
I think there's like a systems component and then a values component, right? So in terms of we're working on it, you can work on it very tactically through systems, but in the meantime, a value system that supports that. So how are you actually rewarding people on a day-to-day basis? Are you actually looking at your funnel and who you're bringing in and who are you promoting? And are you rewarding leaders who act inclusively? I think that if you try to tackle one versus the other, you're not actually doing it. And the more it's integrated into, it's not a D&I initiative, it's an organizational initiative, to your point about all the research, that you can throw a rock and hit research that shows that more diverse, gender, racial, all of that diversity drives business performance. This is a business issue, and it's how we treat people, and it's how we navigate business decisions, I think is how we're working on it becomes much more specific.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.